Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and would like to welcome you to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series event today with Professor Ethan Katz from the University of California in Berkeley. We welcome all of you who are joining in. Bonnie Ellinger is with us to do the introduction, and Bonnie?
Thanks, Ron. Dr. Ethan Katz is Associate Professor of Jewish and Late Modern European History at the University of California, Berkeley. His first book, Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, won 6 national and international awards, from the National Jewish Book Award to the Russell Major Prize of the American Historical Association, the Pinckney Prize of the Society for French Historical Studies, among others. The book examines the history of social, cultural, and political relations between Jews and Muslims in France from World War I to the present. It also attempts to bring historical perspective to France's current Jewish-Muslim crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Ethan Katz.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Bonnie. I'm afraid it's all downhill from here. I want to thank the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival, the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and especially Bonnie and Ron for their kind invitation and all their work to make this program a success. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now for the PowerPoint that I have. So just one second. All right. So in the early morning hours on November 8th, 1942, the American and British armies began Operation Torch. At that time, the largest amphibious landing in recorded human history. The invasion saw 110,000 troops in 800 warships and transports land on a score of beaches spanning more than 1,200 miles along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coastlines. And we can see here the troops arriving in the picture on the right. The key site for the campaign was North Africa, and everyone involved in the strategic planning agreed that victory ran through the rapid seizure of the city of Algiers. Now, it's well known that Operation Torch opened a crucial second front in World War II, soon chasing the Axis forces from North Africa, setting in motion the Allied liberation of Southern Europe. What is far less well known is that the Allied path into Algiers was paved by the work of an underground movement in which a band of young Jewish liberals teamed with a group of arch-conservative military brass and businessmen. Over a period of months preceding the invasion, the resistors coordinated their efforts with the Americans, in particular with Robert Murphy, the special U.S. envoy to the region, who reported directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the last days before the invasion, the home of Henri Aboulker became the headquarters for the insurgency. Aboulker, who we'll hear more about in a little bit, was a prominent figure in the Algerian Jewish community and more broadly respected as a doctor, professor, and local political leader. His son, pictured here on the left, the 22-year-old medical student José Aboulker, had been one of the earliest to organize resistance in Algeria and would assume central importance in the insurrection. In the wee hours of November 8th, the designated date of the Allied landing, a rather motley group of several hundred students, shop owners, doctors, lawyers, and a handful of French military officers managed to take over nearly all of Vichy France's major institutions in Algiers and to place the regime's key leaders under house arrest. The success of the underground was all the more remarkable for the numerous obstacles that it faced. The insurgents were ill-equipped, only possessing several hundred level rifles that predated World War I and tour buses provided by the Americans. In many cases, their claim to authority was thin. They had disguised themselves by wearing armbands with the initials VP, the insignia of a local volunteer militia tied to the Vichy regime. In the days before the invasion, promised arms from the Americans repeatedly failed to appear. At the appointed time on the night of November 8th, at least 1/3 of the young men who had affiliated with the insurgency did not show up. In the midst of chaos, José Aboulker took charge as various teams of insurgents fanned out to key points throughout the city. At a series of locations, the same scene repeated itself. A small group of resistors showed up, wearing the armbands of the local militia and showing orders for them to relieve the Vichy commanders. Unsuspecting, the officers on duty turned over control of each strategic location to the members of the insurgency. Yet as dawn broke, there was still no sign of the Americans. They had elected to take a circuitous path toward Algiers rather than the rapid one originally promised. Now Vichy had begun to fight back. Abulker utilized a blend of ruse and inspiration to rally the resistors over the radio, imploring them to hold their posts for as long as possible. Eventually, late that day, the Allies entered Algiers and took control of the city without firing a shot. Before too long, they would control the broader Mediterranean. Now, at the time of the invasion, North Africa was under the control of the Vichy government, France's authoritarian pro-German regime that had taken power shortly after the French surrender to the Germans in June 1940. In October 1940, of its own accord, Vichy had abrogated the Crémieux Decree, an act that in 1870 had made nearly all Algerian Jews into equal French citizens. The decree had been a turning point in Algerian Jewish history, separating Jews from their Muslim fellow natives who did not enjoy citizenship and became racially defined as indigènes, or natives. It began a process where Algeria's Jews would gradually become deeply attached to French language and culture. Now, with the stroke of a pen, Jews were suddenly demoted back themselves to being indigènes, or colonial subjects. They occupied the same status as Muslims. Further anti-Semitic measures followed. Much to the consternation of the Jewish insurgents, the liberation of Algeria by the Allies did not restore Jews' pre-war status overnight. Instead, a new battle began over the territory's French leadership and ideological direction. Jews, despite their central role in the uprising, did not succeed immediately in regaining their rights. For the first few months following the landing, all the racial laws remained in place, and Jews who had lost their professional position or their property only recovered them on an individual basis. It was only in October 1943, nearly a year after the landing, that Jews in Algeria regained their French citizenship. Scholarship on the Algiers underground and its Jewish participation remains quite limited. This is not a well-known story, as many of you probably know. To date, there has generally been two approaches that scholars have taken to discussing this story. One is treating it as part of the larger military and political strategy of the North African landing and its aftermath. And the second has been to describe it as a case of Jewish heroism soon betrayed by the American invaders and the French administration. These analyses have left us with little sense of who the resistors were and what motivated them. More specifically, we are left to wonder at the curious alliance at the heart of the story. For the group's ideological diversity was remarkable. Monarchists and communists, opponents of democracy and ardent Republicans, and perhaps most strikingly, Jews and anti-Semites, joined together in what became known as the movement of November 8th. How was this possible? In the book I'm currently writing, this is among the puzzles I'm trying to piece together, and it will be the focus of a lot of my talk today as I outline the participants in this rebel alliance and discuss some of the possible catalysts for their cooperation that not only seems counterintuitive today, but did at the time as well. Before I get to that, however, we can only appreciate the history and significance of the Algiers insurrection by placing it within the broader context of the Holocaust in North Africa and European political culture in colonial Algeria. While Central and Eastern Europe, of course, saw the greatest anti-Semitic atrocities during the Holocaust, the nearly 500,000 Jews who lived in French North Africa suffered significantly as well. Many racial laws enacted by Vichy were extended to Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, leading to severe professional quotas, intensive surveillance, and more than 100 labor camps where Jewish prisoners were often singled out for especially harsh treatment. Algeria is particularly significant to the European story. The territory was in large part annexed to France. It wasn't simply a colony, and it was home to almost 1 million European colonial settlers whose political culture was steeped in the anti-Semitism of the 1930s. By late 1941, most Jewish children had been expelled from the public primary schools in Algeria. Most notable and devastating was Vichy's decision, already mentioned, in autumn of 1940 to strip all Algerian Jews of the French citizenship that they had enjoyed for 70 years. The story of the resistance, just like the story of the Holocaust, looks different from the Mediterranean's southern shore. What we mostly know about the French resistance is a classic case in which history has been written by the victors. The wartime triumph and post-war legacy of Charles de Gaulle and his Free France movement and the communists helped to create a narrative that makes several assumptions. First, we imagine that French insurgents emerged in opposition not only to the Germans, but also to the Vichy regime. In addition, we see the resistance as comprised of liberals, Republicans, socialists, and communists. Finally, according to a stubbornly enduring narrative, on one side stood résistants fighting virtuously against Nazi and Vichy anti-Semitism, while on the other side stood anti-Semitic perpetrators and collaborators. The story of the Algiers insurgency problematizes each of these assumptions. So first, the arch conservatives, what historians call today the Vichisto-Résistants. The developments that would become the Algiers insurrection gathered steam across three geographical nodal points. And the first of these was not Algiers, but rather Vichy, the resort town in the Massif Central region of southern France, where Marshal Philippe Pétain set up the new French government after the fall of France in June 1940. As many of you surely know, Vichy was authoritarian, anti-republican, traditionalist, pro-German, and anti-Semitic. It was also, counterintuitive though it seems, an important wellspring of early resistance. While they remain little known, during the early months following the defeat, numerous Vichy officials engaged in a double game. They remained loyal to Marshal Pétain, but they mistakenly believed that he was hamstrung by the occupiers and that they should thus begin to undertake the underground work of resistance that he ultimately supported and might someday openly join. These were among the group that a handful of historians of the occupation in France have in recent years dubbed Vichisto-Résistants. The whole notion of the Vichisto-Résistants really only emerged in the aftermath of revelations in the mid-1990s that then French President François Mitterrand, who is pictured second from the right in that photograph on the left, that he had affiliated for several years with organizations of the far right, and that he had worked loyally for Vichy France until 1943. Until that time, Mitterrand had the reputation of simply being a loyal résistant. Indeed, the Vichisto-Résistants included many, like Mitterrand, who underwent a process of evolution in the course of the war, from Vichy loyalists to full participants in the organized resistance. The term applies as well to those who had been members of interwar extreme right groups, but decided while retaining their ideology to act against not only the Nazis, but also the Vichy regime. Even as they fiercely opposed the Germans and sought to renew the French fight against Nazism, these men and women often supported much of Vichy's social policy, including regarding Jews. This was the case for several key actors in the Algiers insurgency. In order to account for the importance of the arch conservatives who played a leading role in the insurrection, we must turn to the second geographic node in our story, Washington. Washington's eyes and ears in North Africa were substantially those of US envoy Robert Murphy, who reported directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. From the moment of the French defeat in June of 1940, the race was on to find partners in French North Africa who might play a role in an eventual effort to liberate Europe. Murphy, along with other key American officials, took a decidedly pragmatic approach in looking for French partners with whom he might work. Murphy and his colleagues long believed that some version of Vichy might be part of the solution rather than the problem. Now, eventually, the Americans became convinced that General Henri Giraud, rather than Charles de Gaulle, in fact, was the right man to lead the resistance. Giraud was at heart a proud French patriot who believed the Germans could be defeated. What he sought to overturn was not Vichy's social policies, but rather its decision to collaborate with the Germans. Giraud himself was unabashedly anti-Semitic. And the choice of Giraud as leader of the resistance highlights what would become a key pattern of American conduct in North Africa, a single-minded focus on winning the war at the expense of ideological considerations or deep concern for Algeria's Jews. Giraud stepped into a movement where other prominent Frenchmen from the mainland were also in key roles, many of whom were equally or more conservative. This was particularly true of the so-called Committee of Five, the group of French businessmen and officers who worked most closely with the insurgents and the Americans and coordinated many of their efforts. The group included Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, pictured here on the left, who was a committed monarchist and longtime member of the Action Française. The Action Française was a very influential neo-monarchist movement under the leadership of Charles Maurras. It was anti-democratic, it was ultra-nationalist, and virulent anti-Semitism was a central preoccupation from the time of its founding during the Dreyfus Affair in the late 19th century. D'Astier was widely rumored to have participated in the Cagoule of 1936 to 1937. The Cagoule was originally a breakaway from Action Française. It was maybe even more extreme right than the Action Française. It was an underground revolutionary movement. Its long list of avowed enemies and targets included Jews. They worked closely with Italian fascists. They stockpiled weapons, assassinated leftists, and planned a coup d'etat against the Popular Front left-wing government of the 1930s. With a long list of enemies, the Cagoule was, in the words of historian Joel Blatt, authoritarian, even totalitarian, nationalist, anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-democratic, anti-liberal, anti-Semitic, and anti-Masonic. Two other members of the Committee of Five, Jean Rigaud and Jacques Lemaître du Bois, also pictured here, were confirmed former Cagoulards, members of the Cagoule. Rigaud used his closeness to the Vichy regime to foster contacts between certain officials and the movement in Algiers. Lemaître du Bois admired Vichy's anti-democratic, autocratic tendencies and its arch-conservative so-called National Revolution program of national renewal, and he was deeply suspicious of communism. Both were avowedly anti-Gaullist. A fourth member of the committee, Colonel A.S. van Eck, actually headed the Chantier de la Jeunesse, which was Vichy's official scouting organization meant in large part to serve as a youth movement that would acquire and help to spread the values of Vichy's National Revolution program. Van Eck sought to rally several hundred chantiers as troops within the Algiers underground. As the work of Daniel Lee has shown recently, the chantier in the mainland did for a time offer protection to a significant number of Jews. Nonetheless, in November of 1941, in a ministerial memo, Van Eck made no bones about the fact that he thought the chantier in North Africa should not accept any Jewish members at all because Jews, he said, could not acquire the nationalistic values of the National Revolution. So this was not a group of democratic figures, to say the least. And in his memoir of the early years of the resistance, Jacques Soustelle, a well-known resistor, would claim of Rigaud and Lemaître du Bois, quote, their hostility toward Germany was matched by their hostility toward free France. A, quote, free Vichy was not a free France, but rather the National Revolution freed from the Hitlerian shackles and protected by Washington. This is what they wanted, and this is what they almost got. Soustelle's caustic remark hinted at a deeper truth that we can better appreciate in the light of current scholarship on the Vichistes résistants. A key contingent of the insurgency comprised men who, even as they took great risks and joined clandestine networks to resume the fight against the Germans, also had links to Vichy that continued to influence their resistance work. In short, this little-known story may have been the Vichistes résistants' most important hour of the war. What is certain is that it would not have been possible without their unlikely alliance with a scrappy group of Algerian Jews. And it is to them that we now turn. We have to take a moment to situate the world from which the Jewish resistors emerged. By the early 20th century, most Jews in Algeria spoke French, at least in public, took French names publicly, and oriented themselves increasingly toward French culture, even as they retained ties to the North African milieu and customs of their forebears. Even, however, as they often saw themselves as unqualifiedly French, their primary community was made up of other Algerian Jewish individuals, groups, and institutions. Their world was, to borrow David Sorkin's formulation about 19th century German Jews, they were part of a minority subculture of the wider European sector of Algerian colonial society. And one of the points I make in the book I'm writing is that several key commonalities among many Jewish resistors help us to appreciate the distinctive subculture from which the insurgency in large part emerged. The first of these is proximate social geography and kinship networks among numerous insurgents. This takes us into the heart of the third nodal point in our story, the city of Algiers itself. Over the previous generation, as increasing numbers of Jews in Algiers had become assimilated and entered the bourgeoisie, the community had become more dispersed geographically, moving in significant numbers outside of the traditional Jewish quarter. Still, Jews often concentrated in pockets in various neighborhoods, and the insurgents were a microcosm of this reality. Among the resistors, many came from the Babazoun neighborhood on the eastern edge of the Jewish quarter in the lower Kasbah. You can see a map here of Algiers, or the more middle-class areas to the south of there and in the northeast neighborhood of Bab el-Ouad. But a significant number, at least 24 families by my count, also came from the more affluent neighborhoods further to the east toward the Rue Michelet, where the home of José Aboulker, his sister Colette, and their father Henri became the center of operations in the days before the insurgency. Now, I'm sorry. So many of these resistors came from, as I said, these traditional Jewish neighborhoods. At this point, more than 60% of the inhabitants of Algiers were European, That is, they were members of the so-called European settler classes. 9% were Jewish, and slightly under a third were Muslim. So Algiers' entire Jewish population, in its increasingly French linguistic and cultural orientation, was in many ways a subculture within the majority. And as larger numbers of Jews became more European in their culture, and a small number became middle-class professionals like civil servants, doctors, and shop owners, many moved to new surroundings. This is why the changing social geography of the city. The Rue Babazoun, which, as I said, formed a part of the eastern border of the traditional Jewish section, is a street crucial to the story of the insurgency. It remained a major Jewish artery, even with changing social geography in 1940. Running parallel to it, you can see on this map, was the wide European avenue of the Rue de Lyon, which was one of the first streets with which the French invaders had breached the old Jewish quarter. And even in 1940, there and the nearby Place des Chartres were still the city's Jewish commercial center. So, as I say, many of the insurgents came from the Babazoun and the adjacent more middle-class area further south, or in the Bab el-Ouad. At 11 Rue Babazoun, there were two families who would be at the heart of the insurgency, the Athlon and the Aboulker. Until Vichy forbade him from doing so, Emile Athlon ran a gun shop on the Rue des Chartres that provided many of the insurgents' early weapons. On the night of November 7th, dozens of insurgents under his directions gathered at their apartment. One floor up lived Raphael and Stéphane Aboulker, sons of the deceased Dr. Charles Aboulker, and we'll talk more about them in just a moment. They would serve as crucial liaisons within the insurgency between the Géogras self-defense group, that I'll also describe later, and those who were working directly to prepare the American landing. Not far to the south, José Aboulker, who was the cousin of Raphael and Stéphane, assumed his own pivotal role. And so what we see here is there are certain pockets of the city of Algiers where the insurgents were very concentrated. They were concentrated as part of this subculture. They describe how they knew every back alley, every connection from one porch to another. This was a world where people had known many of those who they would work with in the insurgency. Their families had known each other for years or for generations even. And so these neighborhoods were a defining feature of the social fabric of what became the insurrection. This brings us to the matter of kinship networks, which bleeds into the second key characteristic of that Algerian Jewish subculture, which is Jewish activism or Jewish involvement. Numerous Jews who peopled this movement were from families with deep histories at the heart of the Algerian Jewish community, and this is particularly the case for the Aboulker family, who I've already mentioned a few times. The Aboulker had been prominent in community politics for more than a century. They had first arrived, their ancestors, in Algeria from Iberia in the late Middle Ages. And since that time, numerous Aboulkers had been prominent scientists and doctors, but also Kabbalists, psalmists, and rabbis. Their rabbinic pedigree included notable figures such as the famous sage Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, who lived from 1326 to 1408 and is better known as the Ribash. The religious eminence of the family was also local, and it had endured. As recently as the late 19th century, Samuel Aboulker was chief rabbi of Algiers. He was a longtime respected shochet, or ritual slaughterer. He was a member of the Algiers Beit Din, or rabbinic court. Late in life, he migrated to Jerusalem, where he became close friends with Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Rav Kook, one of the great Torah scholars of his generation, and a founder of religious Zionism. In the 1890s, Samuel's nephew, Joseph, would play a key role in wresting control of the Algiers community leadership structure from the mainland French Jews who had dominated it since its founding. The stories of the family were legion, and in many cases, they exhibited the Aboulkers' remarkable capacity to live and thrive in two worlds, one of traditional Judaism and Jewish solidarity, the other of devoted French patriotism and secular colonial society. So, for instance, the great-grandmother of José Esther, or Esti Sasporta, was extremely wealthy and generous. According to family lore, she had given the money needed to construct the original University of Algiers, its medical school, and the city's first high school for girls, as well as to reconstruct decrepit synagogues. Two of José's great-grandfathers brought French schools to Oran and Algiers, respectively, and provided the land for schools where Christian teachers, priests, and nuns could be educated, even sending their own children to study there as well. At the same time, they reached an understanding with the French cardinal in Algeria, Charles Lavigerie, with whom they played chess regularly, that there would be no proselytizing of Jewish pupils at the schools. Lavigerie's relationship to the family also extended to his rabbinic counterpart, Samuel Aboulker. And so in 1890, when Samuel Aboulker prepared to set sail to move to Palestine, the cardinal was among the throng that followed him to his boat. Ultimately, the family traced its greatness much farther back. They firmly believed themselves to be direct descendants in multiple branches of the royal house of the biblical King David, and they possessed extensive archival files meant to prove it. Whatever the factual basis of this claim, it played a role in family lore well into the 1930s. Henri Aboulker's children were steeped in this lore and in a sense of rabbinic and even royal pedigree. This was particularly pronounced in the case of Colette, José's older sister. In the 5-volume memoir of her childhood that she later wrote, Colette reveals how she was reminded at every turn of her lineage and her responsibility that it carried. At the age of 5, Colette was taught that unique among the Aboulker children of her generation, she had a sign, this was a mole on her forehead, that she shared with notable ancestors like the great Rabbi the Ribash, his great-grandson, Rabbi Solomon Duran, who had been a trusted counselor of the Dey of Algiers, the commander of Algiers, and helped in 1541 to save the city from the allegedly invincible Spanish Armada, as well as others. She understood in that moment that when she was older, she would need, as she described, quote, to save the Jewish people in danger, the country in danger, and maybe even the world in danger. Colette was selected as well for one of the Aboulker family traditions linked to the Davidic descent. In each generation, one daughter in the extended family would be anointed and receive a gold or silver crown. And you can see here in the photograph on the right, that is a display of the crown that currently sits in the Israel Museum. José and Colette's mother, Berthe, had been chosen for this honor. And at the age of 6, it was Colette's turn. Her great aunt Mathilde, from her mother's side, approached Colette and placed the gold chiseled hennin crown 50 centimeters high on the young girl's head. Mathilde told her that she was the only one entitled to wear it and would now be the heir to the traditions of the Aboulker family. Henceforth, said Aunt Mathilde, she would have important duties to perform, and as was the custom when she turned 18 and had proven herself worthy, then she would receive the crown on a permanent basis. Now, such a rare pedigree is fundamental to the role of the Aboulkers in the uprising. It helps to make sense of how they had the self-confidence to think that they could take on the Nazis and fight alongside the far more powerful French officers and businessmen with whom they were allied. Likewise, the family background had generated a reputation that many found crucially compelling. When he later described his first meeting with José Aboulker, the future French philosopher and journalist Jean Daniel revealed all that he already knew about José Aboulker and his family. Quote, he was one of the heirs of the dynasty of the Aboulkers, a family of Algerian Jews where everyone had been a doctor for generations and who consolidated power, science, courage, sometimes also sanctity. Our parents would recount to us often the story of Charles Aboulker, an old character full of humor who, not content to bring to his poor patients medication that he prescribed to them himself, would also bring an envelope containing some money that he would deposit in a corner of their house. The Aboulkers formed a clan of hospital doctors, clinic heads, and professors, joined so that none would think that he should be jealous of another. They treated anti-Semites with a haughty air of ignorance. They were not waiting for someone to close doors on them. They had taken preemptive steps. Here we have a picture of Charles Aboulker, who I just referred to here. I think I checked the picture. Yes. Picture of him and then a picture of the throngs that followed his funeral, illustrative of his legendary reputation within and far beyond the Jewish community locally. So this was, for the Aboulker family, not simply an event of national, international, or particularly Jewish import. It was experienced as a family affair. There were, beyond José and Henri and José's sister Colette and their cousins Raphael and Stéphane, the children of Charles, all people that I've mentioned, there were as many as 15 total members of the family from both Algiers and Oran who participated in the uprising. Now, unsurprisingly, in the 1930s, both Charles Aboulker and Henri, José and Colette's father, held leading positions in Jewish-led organizations that sought to fight anti-Semitism and improve relations with the Muslim and Christian populations. These organizations included the major community political apparatus, the Algerian Jewish Committee of Social Studies, the CJAES, and the Algerian branch of the largest French anti-racist association, the International League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, or the LICA. The organizational mission of both the CJAES and the LICA made them logical entry points from which to move into active resistance during the war. The CJAES defined its goals as, quote, keeping vigil in order that Jews' free exercise of the rights of the citizen neither be violated nor little known. The LICA was an organization founded precisely to combat anti-Semitism and whose functions by the mid-1930s included that of having certain members act as a Jewish defense force. Former LICA activists Raphaël Aboulker, Émile Attalon, and André Timim all played leading roles in the insurrection. Shortly after Vichy dissolved the LICA in 1940, Raphaël Aboulker, who had just joined the organization a few months earlier, gathered dispersed members and directed them toward the newly formed Géograce group. Among the founders of the Géograce were also Émile Attalon and André Timim, both former activists in the recently banned LICA organization. And in my research, I've actually identified as many as 36 former LICA activists who participated in the insurrection. There are other examples as well of the active Jewishness of participants who in the insurrection. These include charity to local Jewish aid organizations or schools in the years before the war. And several Jews in the underground were also very involved in creating a newly self-reliant Jewish school system in the face of Vichy's anti-Semitic laws. Being active in organizations like the LICA reflected another element as well, the newly aggressive politics that define the actions and outlook of many participants. One of the characteristics of a new generation coming of age in the 1930s, which highlights again the paradoxical nature of this wartime rebel alliance, was widespread activism in anti-fascist politics. Particularly in the era after the 1934 Constantine riots, a new generation of Algerian Jews joined groups like the LICA and became active in large numbers in the Algerian Communist Party. This marked the beginnings of a key shift. Unlike much of the community establishment of their parents' generation, these Jews took a more confrontational pose, gathering arms, standing up to fascists in the street, and even preemptively attacking. And the clearest echo of this newly aggressive posture within the resistance appeared in the Géograce self-defense group that formed in autumn 1940, and that would in time supply 130 of the insurgents who fought on November 8th. This group saw itself largely as a training ground for Jewish shock troops who would both prepare to fight against Hitler and to defend Jews. Its ranks included 80 so-called toughs, described by resistor Lucien Adès as, quote, muscular daring fighters. They were ready at a moment's notice to confront the local militias that regularly attacked Jews. New aspirants to the Géograce group were closely screened. If accepted, they then took an oath to fight to the death for the liberation of France and the defeat of the Germans, and specifically that they would defend Algerian Jews. And so we come here to this element of a newly aggressive Jewish politics in Algeria that started to crystallize with a new generation of activists already in the 1930s. And we can see that this generational shift was particularly vivid in the Géograce group. The pictures here reflect the fact that the Géograce was a boxing gymnasium. Géograce was a famous local boxer. He gave his name to the gymnasium. He agreed to rent out the space. He thought it was simply an athletic space. He did not realize that it was being used secretly to train these Jewish resistors, and he only understood that really on the eve of the landing as they prepared to participate. But this was a highly really masculine space, because there were all these boxers coming through during the war. There was all of this athletic activity there. It was a space where Jews could effectively reclaim their manhood that had been taken from them by the actions of the Vichy government. The generational shift that I've described was present for Henri as well. And we have a quotation from him that's quite powerful in this regard, as he later recounted the activism of his son and daughter and their fellow young insurgents. He was approached by them about using his home for operations, and he was nervous about what to do. He feared for their safety. He wanted to protect them like any father, but he also admired them, and he explained why. They received no outside material help, absolutely none, and they all made great personal sacrifices. At various times, I tried to reimburse them. They refused. I insisted. They became angry. Having seen all that up close, I loved them all the more. I was disgusted at the general passivity, the universal spinelessness I had seen for years, above all since the defeat. If I had died in 1940 or 1941, I would have died in despair. Having seen the work of the boys of November 8th, I was relieved. I could die in peace. They furnished explosive proof that pessimism should be set aside, that there reside in our youth resources that are unexpected, immense, unlimited. So the newly assertive left-wing politics of this generation of resistors, here's a picture of Henri Aboulker in the hospital where he worked, if you're interested in just a little more of a visual sense of him, that this was a very different politics, obviously, from that of the Vichistes Résistants with whom they conspired. José Aboulker and Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, they understood that this alliance based on disparate goals would only be possible if the movement reached a formal agreement to avoid politics altogether while pursuing its common ends. And the two men did just that, with the understanding that each group would immediately regain its freedom of political action following a successful Allied landing. This was an extreme mixture of strange bedfellows, and it defies our enduring assumptions about the ideological stakes of both Jewish and non-Jewish resistance. So what was it that made this alliance possible? Contemporary political alignments and historical precedents weighed heavily against such an alliance. At the heart of it was a relationship between two men who seemed to have little in common: the young Jewish anti-fascist from Algiers, José Aboulker, and the middle-aged French monarchist, Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie. 55 years later, in an interview, Aboulker would put it this way: we knew that he was a monarchist and even probably a Camelot du Roi. He referred here to the so-called King's Camelots, a youth organization of the Action Française that frequently engaged in protests and violent street altercations in the 1930s. He says, why did I reach an understanding with him? Me, a Jew, 22 years old, an anti-fascist. This man had probably cried death to the Jews during protests in the Latin Quarter in Paris. And this comment alluded to the way that numerous Jews on one side and arch conservatives on the other had been active in opposing camps in the pitched ideological struggles of the 1930s. It also harkened back to a longer history wherein Jews and monarchists had hardly mixed well in modern French history, and there were a number of examples of this. And yet, nonetheless, it was considerations both practical and ideological that brought together Aboulker and d'Astier de la Vigerie, and by extension, many around them. On the pragmatic side, we saw that the US State Department decided to set aside concerns about policy and rights in the short term in order to prioritize military victory. This meant supporting what became a coalition of conservative, even anti-Semitic forces and Jewish activists, since both groups were ready to help pave the way for the Anglo-American landing. Algerian Jews had learned already in the interwar years, particularly after the Constantine riots of August 1934, that they could not rely altogether on the French government to protect their position. While the famous Jewish historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi argued that in the modern era, Jews could only form vertical alliances, that is, with governments, and not horizontal political ones, here was an exception. Increasingly already, Algerian Jews had, for pragmatic reasons, moved away from relying upon government authorities and toward cooperation with other inhabitants of Algeria around shared causes. In the 1930s, this was largely with reformists and Muslims on the left, but after the shattering events of 1940, they were equally prepared to team with forces on the right in a temporary alliance against a common foe. Likewise, in his memoir of the insurgency, José Aboulker himself points out that the military and business leaders looking for a band of rebels had limited options. Here, unlike in France, where they were a tiny percentage of the population, in Algeria, Jews made up 10% of the French citizens. Moreover, Aboulker insists, for those looking for allies to fight the Germans, Jews' particular motivations made them the surest bet. As one historian has argued, political flexibility was more broadly a hallmark of the Vichistes Résistants, the conservative forces that would team with these Jewish shock troops. By 1943, despite their fierce anti-communism, other Vichistes Résistants had decided to work alongside communists in order to be accepted within the broader French resistance. And so the insurrection of Algiers shows that their pragmatism, in fact, started even earlier and extended even to an alliance with Jews. There were also important ideological considerations. Aboulker's supposition about Dastier's participation in anti-Semitic rallies notwithstanding, his brand of monarchism took a more moderate position on Jews. Dastier came from a family that had supported the monarchy for generations. While he retained sympathy for the more radical neo-monarchism of Charles Maurras and the Action Française into the late 1930s, he was more closely allied with the Comte de Paris, the pretender to the French throne at the time. Dastier actually even helped to bring Henri to Algiers right after the landing in the hopes of reinstalling the French monarchy. This was quickly quashed by General Eisenhower. It's another story, but it shows that he was a very committed, really old school monarchist. And in fact, Henri, the Comte de Paris, who Dastier was close to, had condemned the Action Française and sought to create a more moderate strand of royalism. And he had even written an article in January of 1939 in his movement's newspaper, the Courrier Royal, where he denounced anti-Semitism in no uncertain terms. And that column was reprinted in the Bulletin of the Federation of Jewish Societies of Algeria, the community's monthly newsletter. And given the level of involvement of the Aboulker family with community institutions, it's extremely likely that many members of the family and those in the wider milieu of the insurgency would have read that article. They would have been familiar with the more progressive turn in royalist thinking regarding the Jews. The mention of Jewish soldiers specifically here was hardly incidental. Even in an infamous statement where he embraced Marshal Pétain and Vichy, what I also want to emphasize is that the participation of Algerian Jews who had been soldiers was also important. When he spoke about Jews, the Comte de Paris spoke specifically about how Jews had served in the French army during World War I, and that was hardly incidental. Henri Freinet, who was a famous conservative resistor, and made a very infamous statement that was quite anti-Semitic. That statement itself reveals the importance of Jews having been soldiers and this having been a factor in their embrace by the conservative resistors. So he said, Frenchmen of old extraction to the exclusion of foreigners. These are who should be included in the resistance, even those who are naturalized. And Jews if they really fought in one of the two world wars. Jews if they really fought in one of the two world wars. Jews who were veterans, right? And a very significant percentage of these resistors in Algiers had been veterans of the campaign of 1940, right? So here's another factor in terms of the comfort level relatively vis-a-vis these Jews among these arch conservatives who harbored, in most cases, certainly some anti-Semitic sentiments. Aboulker explained his close cooperation with Dastier in simpler terms. We had something in common that the generations of today no longer are familiar with, and which is called patriotism, which was a sentiment of a force that no one could doubt. But part of what appeared to underlay this mutual sense of patriotism was specifically the devotion displayed on the battlefield by José Aboulker, his father before him, and so many of their Algerian Jewish comrades. So let me conclude by noting that this unlikely alliance at the heart of the November 8th insurrection between Jews and frequently anti-Semitic arch-conservatives forces us to rethink our conventional picture of who resisted and why during the Second World War and the Holocaust. Admittedly, part of our misperception can be laid at the feet of the post-war writings of the leading insurgents themselves. In 1946, when Dastier submitted a list of those who had participated in the insurrection, he depicted himself as their undisputed leader. And while he included José Aboulker, he explicitly excluded hundreds of others, mostly Jewish, who were now part of a Veterans Association of November 8th, and he claimed that they were not to be confused with the resistance network itself. This was not true. Likewise, Aboulker's own memoir, while paying tribute to Dastier, spoke about the broader Committee of Five in acid terms. He called them a total failure in contrast to the shock troops he had led, and he described the characteristics of the sincere Vichiste Résistante as, quote, honorable and ineffective, while mocking the group more generally as, by definition, indecisive. And yet, nonetheless, it was this rebel alliance that made the Algiers underground at once arguably the finest hour of the Vichiste Résistante, and strategically speaking, the most consequential Jewish resistance movement of the Second World War. Thank you very much.
Professor Katz, thank you. Could I ask one question? In the beginning, you talked about the events of November the 8th. Could you describe a little bit more the events of that day of November the 8th?
Sure. Yeah, the Americans only revealed their plans for the landing a week or two before they were arriving, and they didn't reveal it to some other resistance groups with whom they had been in touch. It was in some ways remarkable that the insurgents in Algiers had earned their trust enough to get the coordination with them, but they did, and so there was a coded signal from the Americans when the actual landing was taking place. There was a radio that Robert Murphy had given to José Aboulker to install in his father's apartment, and the signal was something like Franklin has arrived. This is Robert. Franklin has arrived, and that was the signal that the Americans had actually landed. But what they were originally told was that they would only have to hold the city for a few hours, maybe until 7 a.m. This was around midnight when the landing took place. But when the Americans landed on the beaches at Sidi Ferruch, like you see in that image that I had near the beginning of the talk, they decided for various reasons not to go the shortest route to Algiers without really communicating for quite a while with those in Algiers. And meanwhile, Murphy was negotiating who would be taking over, and he ultimately negotiated what is known as the Darlan deal, which was this agreement with Admiral François Darlan, who was himself someone who'd been in the Vichy government, who was certainly anti-Semitic, not a Democrat per se, and they believed that he was going to be the most capable of governing. They became frustrated actually with Giraud, who kept making demands and negotiating forever with Eisenhower in the days before the landing. And so Giraud actually doesn't arrive in Algiers like he was supposed to. Raphael Aboulker goes over the radio to claim to be Giraud and try to call on the French army to join the Americans and basically, fight against their own government. Most of them do not do that, right? Most of them are not persuaded to join. And so at a certain point, as Vichy understands what's happening, they realize there's been this ruse. They try to mobilize to fight back. But by that point, they've, everything's in disarray. Their communications had been cut off, and the Americans have been able to advance much closer to Algiers. And so even though they do take back a number of the posts, right, the shock troops had taken over the post office. They'd taken over the radio center. They'd taken over the Grand Palais, where the French commander, Admiral Join, lived, and they had arrested him in his own bed, right? They'd taken over most of their target locations. Well, but they had very few people guarding those locations. They had people with these pre-World War I level rifles. Many of these people had never fired a rifle in their life. So as the French troops come back, in some places there are altercations and they manage to hold the site, but in many cases they give up the site rather than give up their lives. There's only one resistor who is shot. And so they were, the Vichy forces were gradually taking back these key sites, but what they weren't doing, therefore, was fighting the Americans in significant numbers. And this is one of the reasons that as the Americans arrive in Algiers, there's very little opposition, and they enter the city without firing a shot.
We have a question about if there were insurrectionists from Jewish insurrectionists from other areas of North Africa. Specific, there was a question about Egypt. But you clarified part of that by saying who was accepted within the group, partly. But I don't know. Could you address that?
Well, is the question about whether there were insurrectionists or other insurrection groups?
No, my understanding of the question is about coming into Algeria. Were there other?
So there were, right. I mean, there were a few Moroccans. There were a few people who came from elsewhere who became connected. But there were movements in Morocco that were discovered by that were given up or discovered by the Vichy government at a certain point and quashed, where people were arrested. So there were movements in other places. Egypt, that would have been a relatively far way to travel. But I think that this is a movement whose moment of action, big action, really, armed action, is very brief. While there were members of the Géographe network who distributed propaganda on behalf of the Allies and defended Jews when there were anti-Jewish incidents, for the most part, this is all centered on a conspiracy where the action is going to be on one night. And that means this is not like some movements where there's a whole apparatus, there's regular propaganda, they become known, people might have been more likely to come from far. If people were going to be connected to the Algiers insurrection, they really had to be brought in by individual members. They also have basically, they operate in very insular cells. It's actually retrospectively a kind of pioneering moment of clandestine warfare, which becomes much more common in later anti-colonial movements. And so you only knew that the people inside your own cell were in the movement. So there are all these stories about how on the night of the insurrection, people discover that a cousin, a close friend, even like a brother or another family member is part of a different cell as they gathered at these key apartments in Algiers to prepare to go out across the city. I mean, that's how closed off these different cells were. So that helps us understand why it would have been very unlikely for someone to have known about this as a movement and to have come from far to join.
Yes. Okay. We have another question about, was there any coordination with the resistance groups in southern France?
Not the coordination is only in the sense that there's coordination among the conservative resistors, to be sure, right? Henri Giraud doesn't actually, one of the reasons he gets into a whole thing with Eisenhower where he is insisting on having full authority over all of the troops, including the American troops, while they're in North Africa, which Eisenhower balks at. But one of the reasons he's unhappy that the Americans chose to land in North Africa. He wanted them to land in southern France, right? He and a number of these conservative resistors, they are part of networks that cross the Mediterranean of the so-called Vichistes résistants. And so, they are in communication with each other, and many are hoping that the Allies will land in southern France, and then from there, they will fight with them. But the Jewish resistors, who were the focus of our story and were most of the shock troops, they were seldom in contact with Jewish resistors elsewhere.
We have a question about the film Night of Fools. Could you comment on that, or are you familiar with it? Or?
No disrespect intended. I mean, it's not a very good film.
Okay.
I mean, it's a docudrama. I mean, it gets a number of things wrong. It is, missing a lot of the pieces of the story that I told here. And, I mean, it had value for shedding more light on this story. But I think in a lot of ways, I mean, if you look at it was made in Israel. It's made by an Israeli filmmaker. The Israeli filmmaker spoke in the press at times about this as a kind of something like a Mizrahi Sephardic version of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I've said here that this is probably strategically the most significant Jewish resistance movement of the war. So it's in no way to minimize it, to say that it's a very bad analogy to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right? It doesn't really tell us very much about what this movement was. And he was part of it, the filmmaker was part of an effort in some ways to try to bring the memory of Sephardic Mizrahi Jews into discussions of the Holocaust in Israel, but in a fairly polemical way that was sort of, part of competitions of memory, and in some ways competitions over, to sort of show that Mizrahim had also suffered in the Holocaust. So I think that the political dynamics that shaped a lot of that documentary did not lend themselves to good history.
Okay, all right. There was another question about the relationship between monarchy, the difference between Algeria and Morocco. Could you comment on that? Morocco had monarchy, Algeria didn't.
That's a broad question. Oh, you mean because Morocco had a monarchy and Algeria did not?
Right.
So, I mean, they are of a dramatically different character as colonial possessions for France, right? Morocco is what's called a protectorate. It's only conquered in 1911, 1912. Algeria is conquered beginning in 1830. As I mentioned briefly, it is in large part annexed in its population centers to France proper. It has a very different relationship to the central government of France. It is considered really an extension truly of France itself on the other side of the Mediterranean, whereas Morocco is what we would think of as a more conventional colonial possession. Jews in Algeria had all gotten French citizenship, mostly with rare exception, in 1870. Moroccan Jews never have the opportunity to get citizenship in any significant numbers. It's a Jewish population that's about twice as large, but the French government, many regard the Crémieux decree in Algeria as a mistake, and they're very resistant to thinking about imposing something like that elsewhere. And the Jewish community it's a much more diverse community in Morocco, partly because it's so much larger, huge rural community, and much less westernized. Once the Jews in Algeria become citizens, they have the opportunity to go to French public schools. They become more and more, quote, Frenchified in their public identities. And in Morocco, there are schools established by a French Jewish organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle that does provide a kind of path to westernization, but it's a much more diverse population where many people remain much more traditional throughout the colonial period.
Professor Katz, thank you so much for this introduction to this part of the Jewish world that many of us were not as familiar with. So thank you very much for this. We appreciate it.